Good morning. Still, it looks very gloomy out there, and I know Jim says that we shouldn't take the rain in Washington as a sign of anything. We have, as happens in the energy access space, a technological glitch. I have slides because this session is effectively the revenge of the nerds, right? So you guys have been telling us all kinds of things, sort of summoning my inner Luke Skywalker. Everything you said is wrong. No, not really. And so we have a bunch of slides to describe both what we've done and really where we want to go. And where we want to go is somewhere different from where universities typically go. So this is very sci-fi, okay? To boldly go where we haven't gone before. And to do that, we had some illustrations of how we want to get there, which is quite different from the way universities typically go there. And so if I can have the next slide. Someone is listening to me? Yes? Okay. This is magical. It's so magical. I normally don't get to do that, right? So we both described this ambition. And if we have time to actually give you a snapshot of an ambitious research project we've done where we've combed through about 90,000 papers to see how everything you've said may or may not be right or wrong, okay? And so that is about to be released. There's partners here who are very interested in the findings. And of course, again, if there is time where is Sasanka? He just went out. It's so hard to do an impact evaluation. Okay, so to illustrate what is a very hard to do project. That's what researchers do. Okay. Next. No? Right, so researchers write papers. Next. I'm sorry, we write lots of papers, okay? And we write more papers. Next. That's what we do, okay? What does all that say? Next slide, please. Now is it working? This might actually do it? Maybe. No? Okay, next. Someone called for impact evaluations. Of course we do that. Someone calls for impact evaluations. We necessarily do that. We do cost-benefit analysis. We do that all around the world, okay? I'm sorry, I think next. Yeah? Here is where we want to go. We will continue doing impact evaluations and cost-benefit analyses, okay? There was a question about the clean cooking sector. That has been the bedrock of much of the work, those papers that flew by. So we'll continue to do that. We certainly, like everybody and the idiots as well as the smart guys in the world, will be working in the renewable space, okay? Especially solar, that's no surprise at all. Mike Toman here from the World Bank and others have been engaged with a slow-moving process with DFID to try to reorient some of the research on the supply side. You guys actually work in that space. You've given us lots of questions. You have asserted a lot of things. It feels odd to be in Washington to quote Reagan and a Russian proverb. Our job is to trust, but to verify. So all those papers, which take 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, is to show whether when you assert that this is what is needed for the last mile, is it true? Is there a better way? And of course, this is not going to work unless your partners have been involved from the get-go. Electricity is a big part of what we'll be focusing on, the whole menu of things that were discussed this morning. I won't go through any of the points. But also one thing that we have, in the last panel, there was a comment about, I know so much about engineering, I know so much about finance, but I don't understand people. Yes, access doesn't mean use. Access means it's there, it's available, whether the light is turned on, the stove is actually being used, the pump is being fired up, it's a different question, and there's a whole host of research that is on that topic. Okay. Next. I'm sorry, this is totally outside how I normally teach or lecture. It started with a group at Duke, which I think is one reason that Jim was drawn to the place. It is a collaborative place. Engineers and medical scientists and environmental scientists and public policy people and business school folks actually do sit down don't kill each other, and write a paper and work on something. More importantly, next, there is a community in the triangle across 3 universities, the EPA, NIEHS, and RTI, that has been helpful in sort of moving the agenda, sometimes lending equipment and writing proposals together. But really what is different about what we've done is next, this global network that we partnered up with. And Edwin here will tell you a little bit more about EFD, because as Jim said in the morning to kick this off, none of this research is actually can be just done sitting here or in Rome or in London and then just sent out. It has to be done in the places where the problems are. And I think next, SETI is a group that has evolved over the last 3 years, Marc, I guess, more or less, where, as you see, every year when we have an annual conference, the global map gets more colored in, okay, new members coming online, where these are actually university faculty and their students at these places who are pursuing these questions. We are trying to bring the policy community, the practitioners to that. You know that research meets practice is a difficult process. But I think everybody in the network fully embraces the value of actually doing something relevant to avoid type 3 errors. That is, to answer precisely a pointless question. Okay? So we are very much interested in not doing that and doing the opposite of that. Marc will give you an illustration of the systematic review that we've started, some early findings. I think some of you will have take-home points from that you can tweet, quote, cite, but don't, okay? But also, at the end of the day, it's a community of scholars that collectively ask questions about the kinds of things that is bothering you, that you would like to have a clearer answer on. Next. Okay, with that, I'm going to tee it off for Edwin to say something about the Environment for Development Network. And thank you for coming all the way from Cape Town.
Okay, thank you, Subhrendu. So I'm just here to introduce the Environment for Development initiative. So this is a network of about 15 centers in developing countries, and we work with partner institutions in the north. So our basic aim is to make sure that we use environmental economics in order to enhance development. So that's a picture in Ethiopia. Well, so you can see some power cables there. But really the idea with this picture is that we are on some kind of a path towards making some impact on a lot of the environmental problems we face. And the road is not as straight as this. It's not as smooth as this. There are a lot of potholes. It has a lot of rough edges, which we are trying to navigate. So our basic philosophy is, in order for us to achieve impact, the next slide shows the ingredients.
Next. I think they only understand my voice.
Okay. Right, so we are involved, with our centers in academic training. So we support master's and PhD programs. And there are some PhD specialization courses. And we work a lot with the University of Gothenburg, which trains a lot of our researchers. Then we have also institutionalized the research infrastructure at the different centers, so they get some course support to set up a platform where there are always academics doing some work and ready to interact with stakeholders. And there is collaboration which takes place amongst these centers as well as other partners. And at the moment, with support from CEDA, we are distributing about $1 million every year to work on some research projects. But most importantly, our research responds to policy needs on the ground. So there is a lot of research policy interaction which takes place right from framing the research problem. The next slide.
Next.
And the background to all this comes from the success which the University of Gothenburg had using some money from Swedish CEDA. They trained a lot of PhD students, from developing countries. And there was a success rate, a high success rate in all these students going back to their home countries, ready to help their governments. But in many cases, they were isolated, working in isolation, and how could they interact with the policymakers? So that's when this idea came on board to give them a bit more support to do some work which is relevant for their countries. So starting off with these few people who had been trained in Gothenburg, we managed to establish some centers. And the next slide will show some of the centers. Right, so this is where we are operating in. So Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, in Latin America. So these are our hubs. We do not necessarily just work in those countries, but these are the strong hubs, and from there, they will interact with other researchers in the region. And when you look at Asia, so we have China, we have India, we have Vietnam, and we are making a lot of progress in Africa, where very soon we are going to have 8 strong hubs, including Francophone Africa. And Africa is very interesting because when it comes to access to energy, so this is one continent which you cannot leave behind. So universal access, for it to be achieved, you would have had to make a lot of progress on the African continent. Okay, so in concluding, I will indicate that we don't only work on energy, we work on many themes, but of course our flagship at the moment, which I'm talking about, is the Sustainable Energy Transitions Initiative. And with this initiative, we have partnered with Duke University, who are coordinating the research and work around this theme. So they work with researchers from all these developing countries. And these are researchers, who actually talk to people on the ground. So, and there's something to be said about people who actually know the context on the ground. The last slide. Right, so typically at an annual meeting, so we attract 100 plus individuals, and you can see that we have developed a lot of social capital, and we don't only work south-south, we also work north-south, and we are ready, to continue doing a lot of good work alongside the Energy Access Project being launched today. Right, so you can use us as entry points to a lot of those developing countries where you need people on the ground who are good, who can do rigorous work, who can interact with their local policymakers. Thank you.
So as Marc gets set up to talk about this, just one more point here, that EFD is been our founding partner in sort of launching this initiative, but every system in the world is scale dependent. Because that network is there, it has crowded in others from other places, and the annual SETI meeting, for example, has a lot more representation because people want to work with the network, and success begets success, et cetera. To you, Marc.
Yeah, thanks.
And if you could call out when you want the slide.
Yeah, I will. Thanks, Edwin. Thanks, Subhrendu. So I was going to talk a bit about the flagship project of the SETI network so far, which has been engaging in a wide-spanning systematic review. And then I'll talk a bit more about cooking and turn it back to Subhrendu for the end. And in the interest of time, I might sort of speed by some of this. We'll see how it goes. In any case, the point of this systematic review is really to take stock of what the literature is saying about energy transitions in low-income countries. And from the start, we kind of conceptualized, we set up a framework for thinking about energy services rather than technologies. Because at the end of the day, as we've heard in multiple sessions today, what people want is not electricity necessarily, but it's what services they can obtain with that electricity. And there are other energy sources which provide other types of energy services, like we heard about LPG. So that's kind of the overarching framework for thinking about the review. In order for this to be policy relevant, there were really two main thrusts to how we organized it. So one thrust is to focus on drivers and determinants of energy transitions. And by this, I mean, what do we know about the factors that influence adoption of these energy services? And then on the impact side, we're interested in what happens once those energy services are available to people. And these impacts vary across scales. So they could be very micro level impacts on intra-household dynamics, for example, gender dynamics within the household. They could be at the household level, or they can move up to firms, to public services at the local level, to national economy kinds of impacts and broader environmental impacts. So we're looking across those scales at impacts and categorizing the impacts into different types of impacts, for example, on income generation, on health, on productivity and time use. Next slide. So to give you a sense of how this review went about, so we developed a broad set of search terms to capture articles in the literature. And because that was such a broad set of terms, there were many articles that were found, over 85,000. And then we had to actually comb through these papers and code them in systematic ways. Next. Next slide, yeah. So we did that, and the first kind of filter is to gauge the relevance, because when you use these broad search terms, many papers that are not really relevant to the objectives of this review come out, and we have to screen those out. So once we did this screening process with a large team of research assistants, we have about 10% of those articles that remain, so that's nearly 10,000. And then we've done a much deeper analysis of the quantitative studies within that subset, which is about half of those 10,000. And then doing some consistency checks, double coding to make sure that our research assistants are converging in consistent ways. So right now we're in the process of synthesizing the results from this review. And we're trying to identify what the research community knows and what the gaps and blind spots in the literature are. This is just to say also that once we finish the broad overview, that's not the end of the line, because we anticipate that people could use this database to do maybe deeper examinations of particular sub-themes. Maybe somebody's very interested in cooking services, perhaps somebody's interested in refrigeration services, and they could cull the articles from our database that relate to those services and do much more detailed work. Next slide. So just to give you a sense, a little bit more of a sense of what the review has found in aggregate percentage terms, if we look at the services that are covered in these quantitative papers, and this isn't with the full set of papers, but this was through about 65,000 of those 80,000, because we're still kind of checking the final database. We see that among the services, actually cooking services show up much more frequently than other services, which is interesting. Next. And next again. And if we look at particular technologies within the spread, we can see sort of the breakdown there. And again, a fair amount of focus on traditional stoves and fuels and improved cook stoves. That's consistent with this focus on cooking services. Grid electricity, 21% of the papers. This other category is not technology specific, so it may be just energy and GDP kinds of relationships that don't focus on particular technologies. Next slide. And sort of the main sort of, I think, take-home messages here are that cooking is the most covered service. There are more papers on stoves and fuels than on grid electricity, which is kind of interesting. And that all renewables are about equal in this literature in terms of numbers of papers with the grid. Next slide. In terms of looking at the geographic concentration of these papers, this figure shows you the number of papers that are associated with a specific country. And we can sort of start to identify where countries may be underrepresented in this set. So clearly China and India are well represented in the study. There are other kind of large countries that don't have nearly as many papers, and 3 that stand out are Ethiopia, the DRC, a hard place to work, and Indonesia, which we might expect there to be a fair number of papers there, considering it's in Asia where there's a concentration of these papers otherwise. Next slide. We also look at the methods in these papers. Like I said, about 50-50 quantitative-qualitative split in terms of methodologies. There are relatively few experimental or quasi-experimental studies that allow you to make more definitive causal statements about whether one thing is driving another. About 5% of those studies overall. And then in terms of the drivers, we see that cooking, lighting, and heating services are the most covered services for drivers. What is influencing adoption of these services? Renewables are less represented in the drivers and determinants literature than the grid, which is perhaps not surprising because they're more recently coming on. So less work has been done on demand for renewable solutions. And then to look at impacts, we're currently organizing this in terms of heat maps where we can show where the concentration of articles is focused. And so next slide, this is an example of one such heat map where the darker green indicates more papers and white is very few papers, yellow is somewhere in between. Next, what we can see here is that areas of concentration in this firm level impacts are on manufacturing industry and agriculture to some degree. At the national economy level, people have looked at impacts of energy on GDP. These blue highlights are areas that are perhaps not as well represented. And so there are very few papers looking, for example, at the impacts on public service provision of providing energy, education, health, et cetera. And then other indicators of national well-being besides GDP, there are also very few studies. Next. Interestingly enough, if we look sort of at firms which are well represented on average, there's relatively less concentration on agriculture and use of pumping energy. And then non-industrial kinds of energy applications, also relatively fewer. This is just an example of these heat maps. We have similar ones at the household level, and we also have similar heat maps at the environmental scale to look at impacts, where we can start to see where the concentration of scholarship is really focused. Next slide. And if I was to summarize what comes out of these heat map analyses, it's really that there's quite a concentration on the impacts of cooking services and cooking service changes on health. There's a fairly wide spread of services across household expenditures. So these are savings of costs that the household might incur, for example, if it's moving away from kerosene for lighting. There's a lot of work on national GDP and energy. And then there's quite a bit of work actually on also climate-altering emissions from energy services provision. Gaps, however, are kind of interesting in light of the conversations that we've heard this morning. So there's not that much evidence, not much scholarship on micro-level productivity. So this is household income generation, which is a major gap if we're thinking about sort of these last-mile connections, what they mean for people, mini-grids, and how they can enable economic development. Very little, as I said, on public service provision, and relatively little work on the impacts on forests and ecosystems compared to air quality and emissions. Next slide. Of course, there's much more in this review, and this is just a quick overview. And we'll be working to organize our findings over the coming months. Next slide. Okay, so with that, I'm going to switch to this deeper dive into cooking. And I think in the interest of time, since we're sort of running short, we'll skip a lot of the intermediate materials, and I'll pass this back to Subhrendu in a second. But our work at Duke in the energy access space really began with a number of studies on cooking services. And in this space, we've done, sort of following the framework of this systematic review, a lot of similar work in understanding drivers and determinants. So what are the factors that influence demand for improved cooking services? Done some applied cost-benefit analysis to understand what the economic benefits of these cooking transitions might be. And then actually done some rigorous impact evaluation, tying it to new data sources to understand how cooking services are spreading and how we can sort of accelerate these transitions.
It's going to cut to the chase and just stop here. This is a complicated slide in that it's a lot of slides. Why? Because it was a USAID-funded rigorous impact evaluation of, we talked about cooking as being something that folks had ignored in the earlier discussions. That's not true, and it was an electric stove that we were talking about. And was there a demand for that? How much money are people willing to pay? We did this study in the context of a setting where people was claiming no one wants to pay for cooking technologies. And we found that there was a massive latent demand. It's a massive uptake. Half the population switched when offered reasonable products. But what I want to close with and take a few questions. I have no idea what happened to the time schedule because everybody was slipping and we all want to eat lunch and really chat. So the last point I want to make here is that the systematic review, in a sense, sets the agenda for, just think of this, 20, 30, 40 universities moving the action on social science for a while. Just because we are coordinating it, we have some influence, and we have some funds to support that, okay? So the systematic review is moving the agenda there. Obviously, it's going to do something there. Yet, every time I put that up, I always wonder whether those are really the gaps. That's what researchers are studying or not studying. Hannah Gerardo, who almost all of you would have corresponded in some form or the other or emailed with, she and I have a paper in the solar sector where there's only about 40 papers that look at the adoption of solar technologies, yes? But there's about 500 or 5,000 companies doing all kinds of things. So what is the research gap? It's a massive no-do gap. What we know from the science has very little to do with what is being done on the ground, okay? And if we don't close this gap, if these conversations between what all the stuff that you said in the morning and all this nerdy stuff that we've been doing behind the scenes, not in that room, but somewhere, okay, is the whole enterprise of a university partnership with private sector, with donors, with governments, is off the rails if that doesn't happen. And that's exactly where we have a new opportunity today to change that in many ways. Yes, back there.
So I see some really interesting areas that have been identified as gaps that we would love to work with you on, partner with you. As was mentioned earlier, I think in some of the panels, you know, money for research is tough to come by. When you're trying to do a social enterprise, it's not going to come out of the margin. And so, but let's not let that stop us. Let's find a way to work together. You know, we would love to participate in some of this research around closing those gaps and help close those gaps.
Just a quick reaction to that. Just students and faculty there's two ways to think about that. They're not free, but they're cheap relative to most of the world, okay? That said, a lot of them are also doing silly things in some ways, right? You could say that this gap exists because they are pursuing where the literature is evolving and is pushing them, as opposed to where it's just because they are not getting access to the people who want the answers. And that's the conversation we want to change. So that kind of comment is very, very helpful because it says, here are 5 things that we would love to know answers to. And this person was wandering off doing something else somewhere else and couldn't we direct that to that project? Everybody wants lunch, right? Okay, good. Let's go get it. Oh, sorry, yes. I'm surprised you didn't ask.
Well, Subhrendu introduced me earlier. I'm Mike Toman in the research department at the bank, and I just want to emphasize for both the practitioners here and others. I've worked with EFD now for about 7 years, and with Subhrendu, Marc, and others at Duke for about 3 years. EFD is the most solid research network I've ever encountered that has also the reach to be able to get deeply and profoundly into issues in developing countries. It is not at all the sort of fly-in from somewhere else model. And so I've found them absolutely invaluable in our work in the research department. And I think maybe what Subhrendu and Marc have presented in some ways actually understates the importance of SETI because it is a very fluid and yet inclusive network. It is designed especially to close that no-do gap by involving practitioners as sources of advice, as partners, and to be able to move in and out as needed a variety of people, not just at Duke, but in other places, to really make sure that we're going to answer the right questions the right way and get robust results. So an unsolicited commercial that just says amen, and I hope that people will approach Marc, Subhrendu, and talk further with them about opportunities for collaboration.
Hi, my name is Jeff Sotomayor. I work at an organization called CLASP, and we do a lot of work on off-grid appliances, focused on both development of markets for them, but also on the technical side. And some of that work results in the development of what are now fairly extensive databases around product performance, coming out of laboratory testing processes. And I'm wondering, and apologies if I missed this because I wasn't here for the beginning of this session, but is there a connection between sort of harder sciences, engineering, groups that may be interested more in the sort of the R&D and technical innovation side in your all's plan?
Absolutely. So I don't know if now this one is on, but you can hear me back there, right? So absolutely, the answer is yes. What the network started out initially was to, others have written about this, the social sciences have not been doing as much. The behavioral aspects of it, the cultural aspects of it, the institutional aspects of it weren't being treated as a science, and they haven't been doing their part. But for sure, the engineering teams and the medical teams and the environmental teams are working dovetail with some of these projects. So we have an induction stove cooking enterprise with unreliable power that we're studying in India, right? So this is, and the magical thing for the research team is you've got to learn everything at the same time. You may have been trained in economics and policy, yet you're trying to figure out how to measure voltage and trap it. And Rob here, who has his PhD in economics, was spent, the questions he was asking me, none of us on the team knew, and it was invariably the engineers who had to fix it, right? So it's very, very interdisciplinary. These are the problems drive the question, not at all the disciplines, and the hard sciences are a big part of it.